Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a fantastic day. My name is Kmart, and I want to talk about some basketball. And today, we are going to be talking about the Memphis Grizzlies, a team that prior to last night was the only winless team remaining in the NBA in this regular season or through the first week or so of it. They finally got their first win last night, pulled away late against the Portland Trailblazers, so they get a win, get a non-zero number in that win column. But there is something pretty clearly and pretty definitively sort of wrong with the Memphis Grizzlies so far. I think basically no one expected them to struggle this point and start their season 1-6. So we're going to talk a little bit about exactly what's going wrong with the Grizzlies right now. So, we'll start things pretty simply here. Part one of what's wrong with the Grizzlies is the most obvious sort of issue for the team, and that is missing players, whether it's via injuries or suspension for some of them. So, we'll start with the starting lineup themselves. Obviously, Ja Morant remains suspended for his off-season shenanigans, let's call them. He is, as of right now, still supposed to be suspended for, I want to say it's 18 more games, so he's not coming back anytime soon. Another starter in Steven Adams is injured and expected to miss the entirety of this season. So you're down Morant, you're down Steven Adams, you're already in sort of a rough spot trying to fully replace the production and leadership of those two. So, again, there's problem number one for the Grizzlies. Now you have further problems with your bench, right? Because if Morant and Adams are both going to miss significant time, you'd be looking to your bench pieces to pick up the slack and sort of step into those leadership roles. But some of those guys have been dealing with injuries as well. Brandon Clark tore his ACL. He has no clear timetable to return, so he's out. Santi Aldama had missed the first 6 games of the season. He just played, I think, his first game in the win last night because he was dealing with a lingering ankle injury. Now you've got guys like Derrick Rose and John Conchar who are missing some games with injuries that are deemed sort of day-to-day or to be reevaluated, that sort of language. So if you're the Grizzlies, you are missing 2 starters straight up, Ja because of suspension, Steven Adams because of an injury, and there's this rotating, revolving door of 2 to 4 guys from your bench who sort of average you 10 to 20 or more minutes a game in your rotations, who are sort of floating in and out on that injury report as well. So the starting lineup is not what we're used to, and the backup rotations are being sort of afflicted by these injuries as well. So if you're the Grizzlies through 7 games, a lot of what your second unit looks like varies from night to night, and that's very difficult to actually play around, and part of the reason why the Grizzlies lost their first 6 games of the campaign. So there's the obvious thing, right? Part 1, injuries, suspensions, players not being available, etc. But now we get into maybe a little bit more of the statistics part here. Part 2 for the Grizzlies in terms of what's going wrong has been just straight up defensive regression, but maybe not necessarily where you'd think, right? So last season, the Grizzlies were the second best team in the league by defensive rating overall. Through those first 6 losses, not counting the win they got last night, they were ranked 18th in the league. That is a pretty cataclysmic decline for them there on the defensive end. And of course, part of that goes back to the injuries that we were talking about, right? The defense sort of slips a little bit. You would think with guys like Steven Adams gone, with Santi Aldama missing 6 of 7, Brandon Clark being out for all 7 of their games in particular, the front court defense that's supposed to, or what was supposed to be pretty dominant, is kind of thinned out, right? Now you're looking at a defense that's reliant almost exclusively on guys like Jaren Jackson Jr., who, I mean, defensive player of the year, but he's still just one guy. Players like Xavier Tillman are getting pushed into bigger roles. The Grizzlies are pretty significantly going with the strategy here where they sort of occasionally shift a small forward down a position when needed. So a lot of guys are playing at that 4 spot ever so slightly undersized because they're really supposed to be a wing and they're kind of pressed into service down low. So everything that I just said makes sense from a certain perspective, right? Oh, their defense has regressed. Well, some of their big men are out. Here's the thing, though. Everything that I just said is technically true, but that's not the actual problem here with the Grizzlies. It's a little bit of a fake out, because that strategy that I talked about, relying on Jaren Jackson Jr., putting Xavier Tillman in there more, shifting a 3 down to a 4 as much as possible, for the most part, that's worked. That has actually held strong for the Grizzlies. Through those first 6 losses on the campaign for the Grizzlies, they gave up the 3rd fewest paint points per game, 44 points per game. They were top 5 in the league in terms of blocked shots. They gave up the 2nd fewest 2-point field goals of any team in the league, which was 25.2 per game, give or take. So, you know, they're giving up 44 points in the paint per game. They're giving up 50 points, 50.4 technically, but whatever, per game just off of 2-point field goals in general. That's pretty damn good. The defense is not surrendering a whole lot on the interior, or at least inside of the 3-point line. There is one slight thing about the rebounding through those first 6 games. They were being out-rebounded by, on average, about 3.5 boards per game, but that's not exactly a fatal blow to the defense, right? That is a stat that obviously they would love to get back. You want to have a positive rebounding differential for yourself, but that is not a death knell for a team to be out-rebounded by 3 or 4 per game. So the interior defense is not really that big of a problem for the Grizzlies. Yes, they're dealing with injuries, but the guys that they've put in there, whether it's their usual position or not, have been able to hold the line for the most part. The problem with the Grizzlies on defense through those first 6 losses was their defense beyond the arc. They were, probably still are, one win doesn't change this. They are a terrible team in terms of defending 3-point shots. Truly, genuinely awful. They were allowed, again, just in those first 6 losses, not counting the win last night, they allow the 4th most 3-point attempts per game, 39.5 on that mark. They allow the highest 3-point percentage against, which means their opponents are shooting 41.4% against them on average from 3, and they allow the most 3-point shots made per game at about 16.3. So I mentioned before, you know, they're allowing 44 points in the paint per game. They're allowing about 50 points per game off of 2-point field goals. They're pretty much allowing the exact same amount of points from 3, right? 48.9 is slightly lower, but it's comparable in this case, and it's more than pretty much any other team in the league is allowing. And so they have a pretty serious problem, and it's kind of across the board here for the Grizzlies as well. If you break it down on an individual player basis, and for this example, I do just want to point out, I'm excluding 2 players who have only played 2 games each, so their numbers are kind of skewed, so I did not include them. But for players who had played the majority of those first 6 losses of the season, if you look at the defended field goal percentage, which is the shooting percentage of opposing players when a player on the Grizzlies was guarding him, for 3-point shots, Zaire Williams has the lowest defended field goal percentage from 3, which is 29.2%. So Williams is holding 3-point shooters he's guarding to 29.2% shooting from 3. That's not bad. The problem is that's the best. The next lowest on the team is 36.4, and you need to keep in mind that the league average 3-point percentage so far this season is 35.7. Meaning that anyone who's not Zaire Williams is allowing opposing players that they are defending to shoot better than league average from 3. That's kind of awful, right? Basically, if Williams isn't the primary defender, any person shooting any three technically has a statistically higher than average chance to make that shot, which is part of the reason why they're giving up the most three-point shots per game to their opponents. They're just not really defending it all that well. So in terms of the defense, the Grizzlies are kind of holding the line in terms of their interior defense, but the exterior defense is really continuously letting them down. So that moves us into part 3 here, which is the offensive end for the Grizzlies. If the defense isn't really stopping that three-point shooting, then what's the offense doing to make up for it? And unfortunately for Memphis, they have a real sort of live by the three, die by the three kind of mentality on both ends of the court. So the defensive concerns are there, right? As I pointed out, they are giving up a lot of threes, but those concerns could be overcome with a strong enough offense. And it should be noted for the Grizzlies, a lot of these losses have been close. Of their 6 lost games, 4 of those losses were by single digits. So very much games that were still sort of in the balance, still winnable for Memphis. The problem is that the Grizzlies are absolutely in love with the long ball. They love shooting the threes just as much as they apparently hate defending against it. The problem is that they're not hitting enough threes to make up the difference here, right? The Grizzlies shot, through those first 6 losses, the 3rd most threes in the league. They took on average 41.5 three-pointers per game. Unfortunately, they're just 11th in actual made threes per game at about 13.2 per game, which leaves their three-point shooting percentage through those first 6 games at 31.7%, which is 25th in the league. So they love to shoot threes. They take a whole hell of a lot of them, but they are unbelievably inefficient when it comes to actually making them. I mentioned before, in the last segment, the league average so far this season is sort of in the 35 to 36% range. They are shooting 3 or 4 percentage points below that as a team in those first 6 losses. So that's a bit of a problem. But we see a lot of teams in the modern NBA relying heavily on the three-point shot. If they're not making it, then that's where you have to sort of balance things out with scoring from other areas. And that's what the Grizzlies are really also failing to do. They take a lot of threes, but they don't really take a whole lot of two-point field goals to balance it out. They had the 28th most two-point field goal attempts per game in those first 6 losses, and the 27th most two-point field goals made per game, and their two-point percentage was 19th in the league. So, as I said, they're not really showing a balanced attack here. It was more threes than twos for this team in those first 6 losses. They weren't making up that point differential from the missed threes at the free throw line either. They were 22nd in the league in free throw attempts and 23rd in the league in makes. So you're not picking up too many freebies from the line. You're not really getting too many points in the paint to balance out your poor three-point shooting. And I mentioned earlier on sort of more threes than two. That is an actual literal fact for some of their best scorers. Of the team's top 4 players by points per game, 2 of them, Marcus Smart and Williams, are shooting more three-pointers per game than they are two-pointers per game. And the third of those 4 players, Desmond Bane, has a differential between his 2-point shots and 3-point shots of 0.8 per game. So he's basically on the line there as well of shooting just as many, if not more, threes than twos. In fact, that stat may... Actually, I think it probably drifted more towards the 2-pointers than the 3-pointers after last night's game, but yeah, it didn't have those stats on hand. So your top scorers are shooting more threes than twos a lot of the time, which brings us back to the previous point, where they aren't making enough threes to make that a viable strategy, right? If the Grizzlies were out here being a sharp shooting team, if their three-point percentage as a team, instead of being in the low 30s, was approaching league average, right? 35, 36%, pushing up northwards of 40, then maybe this would work a little bit. Maybe some of those single-digit losses would have been wins if you could put in 2 or 3 more three-pointers in any of those games. but they aren't. They weren't making those shots. They weren't hitting. They were continuing to shoot. They weren't really changing things up. They said, we're either going to make our threes and we're going to win, or we're just going to lose the game. And through the first 6 games of the season, the result was consistently that they lost. So now we come to the final point here, part 4, which is how did they get that first win on the board? Because as I mentioned at the start, the Memphis Grizzlies did win last night. They beat the Portland Trail Blazers. They got that 0 out of the win column. And the question is, well, how did they do it? And the answer, to be a little bit smug about it, is to basically address all the concerns that I just laid out for you in this video. They didn't go wild with their 3-point attempts here. I mentioned earlier, in their 6 losses, they averaged 41.5 3-pointers per game. They shot 32 3-pointers last night against the Trailblazers, which is still a lot, right? I mean, it's not massively slashing that, but 32 compared to nearly 42 that they were shooting on average is showing a little bit of restraint. And on the other side of things, the Trailblazers shot 45 3-pointers, right? So we come to the question of their defense defending the 3. The Grizzlies did an okay job of that. The Blazers shot 45 3-pointers. They made, well, I'm not going to do the math, but they shot 31.1%, which is not bad by any means, but for a Grizzlies defense that was surrendering significantly higher shooting percentages than that, it's a step in the right direction. The Grizzlies cut down on their own 3-pointers. They shot about 40% from beyond the arc, and they played better defense when their opponents were wildly overshooting from 3 themselves. That point differential starts to go their way. Meanwhile, 2 of pretty much their most important players offensively, Desmond Bane and Jaren Jackson Jr., finally saw the light in this game last night and had good shooting games. I think Bane shot like 40-something%. Jaren Jackson Jr. shot like 60% or something like that. And they only took 13 combined threes. 4 for Jaren Jackson, about 9 for Desmond Bane. Which, again, yeah, 13 threes combined between 2 players is still a lot, but it's way less, way fewer than they were taking previously in some of those losses. And the biggest thing to see here, if you look at those stats, they only combined to make 4 of those 13 threes. But that's kind of the point. The 3-point shot was not falling for them. Bane and Jaren Jackson Jr. could not put it in from outside of the arc. So instead of doing what they had previously been doing in those 6 losses and just continuing to chuck the ball at the rim, they started to shift. They started taking a lot more shots inside. Jaren Jackson Jr. especially just sort of lived on the interior against the Trailblazers, especially when DeAndre Ayton wasn't on the floor to try and stop him. So the Grizzlies did not fall in love with the 3. They took higher percentage shots when it was pretty clear that the 3-point shot wasn't available to them. And lo and behold, they come away with a win against Portland, who admittedly is not the greatest team in the league. They're very young and very inexperienced. But the Grizzlies needed a win, and they got a win. They pulled away late. They made that run in the 4th. And they did it by going away from the pitfalls that had cost them 6 consecutive games. And I think that has to be the plan for the future here. The Grizzlies are not going to give up on shooting the 3. Their players will not do that. But there needs to be some moderation there. They need to understand, hey, if we aren't getting that shot to fall, we need to start trying something else. We've got guys like Bane, guys like Jaren Jackson Jr. who can go get you a bucket inside if needed, and to not just rely upon, hurling a 3 up there every single time. And I think a lot of these problems will potentially go away when Ja Morant returns. That's a large part of their offense in terms of playmaking, in terms of Morant's ability to just sort of drive into the lane and either get a bucket for himself, draw a foul, or set up for a teammate. Without Morant, they are missing that primary guy, and now even their sort of backup point guard in Derrick Rose is dealing with some injuries, so their offense stagnates a little bit without their sort of dynamic playmaking point guards, and so a lot of the time their offense does settle for 3-point shots. But you cannot afford to do that. That is a valid excuse, but it's one that the Grizzlies need to push past, because if they continue to play this way, if they carry on with this trend of being 1-6 at the start of the season, then by the time Ja Morant comes back, you are going to be so unbelievably behind that it's going to be hard for them to catch up with the rest of the Western Conference. So, there you have it. Long story short, what's wrong with the Grizzlies? What's up with the Memphis Grizzlies? They are dealing with a lot of injuries, and because of that, their offense went to a very sort of stagnant place that they didn't want it to be in. They finally sort of broke out of that rut to get the win last night. The question now is, do they continue to play that way, or do they fall back into some of those bad habits? Because if they do, there could be a lot more losses ahead. If they can stay in the position they were last night, this is still a very good team. Even without Ja, even with some of their injuries, we know Desmond Bane and Jaren Jackson Jr. can score, and that should be enough for the Grizzlies to be competitive. They just need to, again, not fall in love with the three if the three is not falling for them, and they definitely need to play better defense against those three-point shooters as well. So that's what I've got. If you're a Grizzlies fan, obviously you're encouraged by last night's win, but let's see if they can sort of keep up that level of play, or if they, again, sort of relapse into those bad habits. But let me know what you think. Do you think last night was an indicator of how the Grizzlies are going to play moving forward? Do you think this could all be fixed by Ja coming back? Do you think that the rotations the Grizzlies are putting together are sort of the best ones with the players they have available? It's not really fully their choice because guys keep getting hurt, but maybe there's something else that they could be trying, because they're 1-6 to start the season. But whatever your thoughts are, please feel free to let me know. But other than that, thank you all so much for watching, and I will talk to you later.